Welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. Today, I'm speaking to research scientist at Orreco, Georgie Bruinvels. Thanks for tuning in to episode 294 of the Pacey Performance Podcast. So I first spoke to Georgie on a PlayerMaker webinar, which was all around train the female athlete. And straight after that, well, even during that conversation with Georgie where we did a Q&A, I was planning on texting her after to see if she wanted to come on the podcast because she was so impressive with the information that she was sharing around the menstrual cycle. So in this episode, we discuss the menstrual cycle in depth, or Georgie discusses the menstrual cycle in depth. We discuss breaking down the barriers and how male coaches can potentially broach that subject with their female athletes. Georgie discusses mapping the menstrual cycle, common symptoms, health screening, and busts some menstrual cycle myths and some common misunderstandings. So a really interesting chat, and it's an area that I find absolutely fascinating. And it was Dawn Scott who I spoke to earlier on in the podcast, and if you want to have a little listen to that, you can dive into the archive. But it was in that episode with Dawn that I got a real interest in this area. So to have Georgie on and discuss it again was absolutely superb. She's an absolute gun. She's superb, brilliant. So if you are working with female athletes, or even if you've just got an interest in this area, it's an incredible listen. I've shared it with a couple of colleagues of mine and of Georgie's who've listened to this already before it's gone out, and they were super impressed. So I know you'll absolutely love this episode. This episode of the Pacey Performance Podcast is sponsored by Hawking Dynamics, the world's first wireless force plate testing system. So the Hawking Dynamics system is built around what coaches want, so they can test in the real world and not just in the lab. So you're able to capture reliable data on all athletes in a matter of minutes and monitor progress from their cloud-based system from anywhere in the world. So as I've mentioned, the Hawking Dynamics force plates are wireless, which means they're portable, and they're also trusted by teams at a number of different levels in a number of different sports. So integrating force plates into your athlete monitoring system could not be easier and more affordable. So if you want to get to know a little bit more about Hawking Dynamics, or actually see their plates in action, head over to the website, which is hawkingdynamics.com, which you can also schedule a demo, and follow them on Twitter at Hawking Dynamics. This episode of the Pacey Performance Podcast is sponsored by iMeasureU. So used by leading sports practitioners and biomechanics researchers worldwide to capture and compare multi-limb inertial data in the field, IMU Step from iMeasureU is a dual sensor and app lower limb load monitoring tool which helps practitioners optimize return to play for running-based sports. So iMeasureU have just released their new and improved waterproof sensor Blue Trident, which includes ultra-high G capabilities to quantify high-impact steps such as cutting, landing and sprinting, longer battery life to collect data all day, real-time feedback to aid immediate interventions, and faster workflow so practitioners can review long training sessions within minutes of training completion. iMeasureU, now part of Vicon, works with military, pro and collegiate coaches and athletes from around the world, including the Australian Institute of Sport, US Department of Defense and collegiate and pro teams from around the world. If you want to get to know more about iMeasureU, head over to their website, iMeasureU.com, or follow them on Twitter or Instagram at iMeasureU. So without further ado, over to the episode with Dr. Georgie Bruinvels. Thanks for tuning in to the Pacey Performance Podcast. This evening, I am delighted to welcome Georgie Bruinvels. So thank you for coming on, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Did I do okay with your surname?
Perfect.
Excellent.
Nailed it.
Like I said to you before, it's my biggest fear. Time zones, and we're all right because we're both in the UK, so that's nothing for me to worry about. But secondly is mispronouncing people's surnames, so I can nail both, thankfully.
Well, I really don't mind.
No, it's all good. So anyone who doesn't know who you are, would you give us a bit of a background on yourself, what you're currently doing, education-wise, and what you've done previously?
Yeah. So right now I am a research scientist at Orreco. I can explain a bit more about Orreco in a bit, I'm sure, but Orreco is essentially like a sports science and data analytics company. So we work with athletes all around the world across a whole range of different sports. My background is, so my undergraduate was in physiological science from Bristol University. Then I worked actually for UK Anti-Doping in the city for, I think it was about 3 years, got to work at the Olympics, which was absolutely amazing in London. Then I went and studied for my PhD at UCL. It was all around iron metabolism, the menstrual cycle, and the female athlete. And then I started working for Orreco, initially part-time through my PhD, and then I've been full-time for, I think it's about 4 years now, actually. That's me in a nutshell.
Yeah, no, that's great. So in terms of, what were you doing for anti-doping?
Yeah, so I was effectively helping with the coordination of testing, so working out which athletes to test and when, and helping with the planning and management of it. I also got to do some work with the science team, which was obviously, that was my passion, but I came in at a sort of entry-level job, and then I got to do some pretty cool stuff, I guess doing profiles around new and up-and-coming drugs. I got to go over to the lab at King's College, see what they're up to there, which was awesome. Did some education sessions, and I did a stint in the intelligence team as well, which was really cool.
Nice.
And that definitely, when I was young, I think I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I was very much into science, and I loved all things about the female physiology, but there was also a small part of me that thought I wanted to be this young independent woman in the city. So I felt like I kind of got that bit done. And then I was like, I need to go back to science. So yeah, then I did my PhD.
Excellent. So Orreco, talk to us a little bit about that. I know we mentioned it on the webinar that we did with Steve, the guys at PlayerMaker. It'd be interesting to just go through that again, maybe dig a little bit deeper. I know people are interested in what you guys are doing, keeping it a bit more visible. And just a bit of an intro on them would be great.
Yeah, so Orreco was founded by Dr. Brian Moore and Dr. Andy Hodgson, who are both Irish. Andy Hodgson is a medical doctor. He's actually a hematologist. He does some really, really cool work over there and always puts my life into perspective. And Dr. Brian Moore did his PhD actually over in the UK at Brunel University, but his real specialist area is around understanding athletes' biomarkers, so blood biomarkers. So if you did a blood test on an athlete, you really, I guess Brian would dig deeper and really understand how their specific biomarkers were changing longitudinally, so over time. And really, Orreco came off the back of Brian just seeing all these patterns emerging, primarily in distance runners. He spent a lot of time in Kenya working with athletes over there. And I think he felt that he could just see when an athlete was overtrained. He could see when they were at increased risk of illness or injury. And so he combined with Andy Hodgson's sort of medical hematological understanding and decided to form this company called Orreco. Now Orreco has loads of different clients from different sports. So I guess that was the initial model of just longitudinal biomarker testing, which is still kind of our bread and butter, but we've added on more kind of services on top of it as we've grown as a company. But essentially we work with athletes in the NBA, in the Premier League, in golf, in swimming, in track and field, canoeing, some rowers from our female athlete side, a whole range of different sports, essentially. And our aim is to effectively be the team within the team. So we support the medical team, we support the performance team to make informed decisions based on athletes, hematological profiles. So be it the blood test, that like full blood test where we have like an extended blood testing, looking at markers of oxidative stress, like inflammation, immune profiles, etc. And so we do that sort of 4 times throughout the season in our like professional teams. And then alongside that, we have point of care tests, so we can provide like snapshots on any one day to help again, the support team know whether an athlete is at risk of overreaching or if they are, carrying a slight infection. And so Dr. Charlie Pedler and Dr. Nathan Lewis are our kind of 2 key scientists at Orreco, and they have very much like built up this program and this platform to help us be really smart around informing that support team whether an athlete is good to go or whether they need to completely pull back or whether there needs to be some halfway house. And so I guess like that's the kind of history, but then more and more over the last like probably 18 months, a lot of my personal focus has been around our female program, which like I feel very lucky to have been able to develop along with some of my colleagues at Orreco. And so because obviously there's not so much money in women's sport, that the way that looks is a bit different at the moment, even though I hope long term for our services or us to be able to support our female athletes in the same way, like hematologically, as our male athletes. But at the moment we're kind of taking a different approach with it, very much to almost start at the bottom and build up and kind of put extra layers on top of what we're already doing.
Nice. So in terms of your PhD, we'll go back there, and just have a little bit of a discussion around that, and then we'll get more into the discussion points and menstrual cycle and all the interesting stuff around that. So, in terms of your PhD, what was the focus, and how is that kind of informing and helping what you guys do now, what you do now, and what you guys do now?
Yes, so I started my PhD very much focusing on trying to better understand iron deficiency. So how you identify iron deficiency, so which like markers you should be using to identify if someone's iron deficient and what the cutoff should be for them. So for example, everyone talks about, oh, my iron's good, or oh, my iron's bad, or I typically have bad iron. And that's normally based on a marker called ferritin. So serum ferritin is like what the assay or the sample that would be run, and that in itself is very widely used to just say, yes, you need to supplement with iron or you really don't. But actually, the guy who's part of our research group in the like iron world, Dr. Richard Burden, he did his PhD before me, again under Charlie Pedler as a primary supervisor. And he very much showed that supplementing athletes with iron based on certain specific ferritin kind of cutoff points actually didn't do anything to their performance. And so technically you can say that if someone's iron status is suboptimal for them, if you supplement and improve that iron status, then if there's a physiological improvement or a psychological improvement or general improvement, then that would suggest that they were iron deficient. If there's not, then you think, well, actually they're not iron deficient because it wasn't affecting any of the measured variables. Anyway, so he very much started questioning, actually, is the typical cutoff for ferritin appropriate? And so my aim was to then come in and say, okay, let's further our understanding here. Let's use different. So he used a cutoff of ferritin of 35 in women and 40 in men. And so my aim was to come in and look at, okay, what happens if we brought that right down to lower and then like assessed that, but also adding in like a slightly different dosing protocol and then looking at other biomarkers as well of iron status, so like serum transferrin saturation, etc. So that was kind of the initial plan, and I very much did stick to that like in part, but then I think the aim for me was to find some people who were more susceptible to iron deficiency initially, and obviously my passion is the female athlete, so I kind of wanted to keep focusing on the female athlete and focus on the female athlete for my PhD. So my first study was aiming to effectively look at heavy menstrual bleeding, because you would say that would increase risk of a compromised iron status. So then you would effectively find people who could be part of this iron study. And anyway, I was doing a bit of digging, and I, at the time, was also doing some work in the lab with some of actually my training partners who were like doing monitored treadmill runs at altitude in the St Mary's lab. And I just remember like a few of them talking to me about their periods and saying, oh, they're heavy bleeders. And I was like, what do you mean you're a heavy bleeder? How do you know you're a heavy bleeder? And so actually that was in the back of my mind, that elite athletes can be heavy bleeders, when actually you'd kind of think a lot of historical research said elite athletes, particularly runners, don't even have periods or don't have regular periods. So that was kind of something that got me thinking. But anyway, we then decided to do my first PhD study looking at prevalence of heavy menstrual bleeding, totally never explored before in athletes or exercising women at all, with a view to then find iron deficient women. Anyway, so I was really lucky actually. Charlie has a good colleague called Dr. Courtney Kipps, who works for the London Marathon, and I managed to get permission to go and survey women at the like pre-event number collection exhibition at the London Marathon. And so I went there. I actually just ran my first marathon the weekend before. I remember thinking in advance, like, I think because you don't know when you're going to run a marathon. I remember preparing for all eventualities, actually got someone to be prepared to cover for me in case I died. But anyway, luckily I was fine. But I spoke to 1,072 women, and it was like an absolute mic drop moment for me, that 4-day window. And I felt like I was just addicted to being there, because it was like I just gave women this opportunity to talk about their period, and it was like they'd never had that before. And because my background's very much been in science, I do understand that, but they didn't. And I'm not saying I understand everything, but I had more of an understanding. And, you know, women were saying to me, I'm going to be on my period when I'm racing in London on Sunday. Like, what should I do? Can I run? I thought I was just supposed to stay in bed with a hot water bottle. Should I just take loads of painkillers? Or I'm going to be premenstrual. I'm in so much pain. How do I deal with this? How can I manage it? And it was just like question after question after question. And it was actually really, I say it was a mic drop moment, but it was also really sad, because it made me realize how debilitating some people's symptoms are. And alongside that, I think it was like the level of education, but also the lack of historically talking about it. And that was actually one of the things that we found as part of this study that we ran, that people just don't talk about it, because often you don't know your experience is abnormal, because you might only talk about it to your mother, who there's a genetic component to a lot of this. You might be going through the same thing. So that very much kind of changed the tack of my PhD, or I say very much, but that did in some parts. And also when I came into Orreco, I think I was also very much alert to this need. And so, then my PhD kind of went down. So keeping on focusing around heavy menstrual bleeding, part of my PhD was funded by Bodyform, so the sanitary product provider. And I did like a campaign with them, which was really cool, actually, just to like raise awareness around the fact that you can exercise when you're menstruating, and at different times in your menstrual cycle, you might feel a bit different, but actually that's okay. And just raising awareness around that. Then my next few studies were drilling down into iron deficiency alongside heavy menstrual bleeding, and then finally I did like this big iron deficiency study at the end. That was the.
No, that's really interesting. So when was that? When did you complete it?
I completed it I started it in 2015. I think, and I completed it in 2018.
Mm-hmm. I know that's not that long ago. It's only a couple of years ago. But do you think in your work with athletes, do you think there's been any change in how people are readily willing to communicate about menstrual cycle, just in that even in that short period?
Definitely. My PhD literally kind of kicked off with Heather Watson saying at the Australian Open that she underperformed because she was menstruating. And for me, like, as sorry as I felt for her, she just come off like an amazing win at the Hobart International. And she went from that to then losing in the first round. And I've actually spoken to Judy Murray quite a lot about this and said, like, even though I feel really sorry for her, it helped me massively because actually she was someone that spoke up about it. And then Petra Kvotova did as well. Paula Radcliffe has done, Jess Judd has done. And there's a few people who have kind of been making headlines for it, which I think does help people talk about it. However, one of the big things I say, as much as our probably like media team don't like it at Orreco, but this shouldn't be making headlines. It's a normal, natural process that we need to be normalizing. And I definitely do think it is normalizing. I think that the Telegraph Women's Sport are doing some amazing work around normalizing all aspects of female physiology. And I think the more we can do that, the better. I think a large reason for that is just the lack of historic education around it. And, a big passion of mine is to like tap into the school system and help people, be educated from a young age so they're not embarrassed about it and they don't have a fear of it.
I'll tell you a little funny story. I think you'll enjoy it. After the podcast that I did with Dawn, when was that? Probably maybe 6 months ago.
Okay. Yeah.
I'd just done it before my wife had a Christmas party with work.
Amazing.
And
yeah.
I don't really know her work colleagues. I didn't at the time anyway. And we'd had a few drinks, and then one of them said, "So, what do you actually do, Rob? Like, are you some sort of like journalist? What's this podcast?" So I was talking to him about it, and he's like, "So who do you have on?" I was like, "Well, who would you know?" Well, Dawn Scott, US Women's National Team, and he was like, "Well, what?" This was a guy and his wife who I don't really know and still don't know. Yeah. But this is the reason why. And he was like, "Oh, well, what do you discuss?" So I went into it, and the guy almost like shriveled and died as I started talking about it. And I guess that's probably quite a common thing to have happen if you're gonna. Not that it's pretty appropriate to start discussing it at Christmas parties when you don't know anyone. But I thought it was really interesting because I was really interested in it, and obviously the great work that Dawn was talking about, and it was just I was quite normal about it at that point. They clearly weren't, and had never discussed it between themselves.
Oh,
that was an interesting one. Well, it came across that way.
Yeah. And it is interesting because, like, my dad, like, when I was growing up, I remember if he came into the room and me and my sister were talking, or me and my sister and my mum were talking, and we didn't want him to be involved, he'd say, "What are you talking about?" And we'd say, "Periods," and he'd literally like run out the room. And even now, like, people ask him what he does. Like, I read this email he sent to someone the other day, and they said something about like, "What's your daughter up to?" And he said, "Oh, she deals with women's things." And I was like, "Oh my gosh, you're my own father." But I feel like that there's definitely a generational element to it as well. But the more we can, like you having Dawn on, like kind of having me on, like that kind of, that will hopefully will help to increasingly like break that barrier. But also I do think education is so important. And actually, like I always say this, let's step back and realize that women's hormones are fluctuating in this pattern that is cyclical. And yes, there's a like menstrual period, there's a bleed at one point in the cycle, but the rest of the time hormones are constantly changing. It shouldn't just be about the bleed. That's just a kind of side effect of the hormonal changes. So looking at it more objectively, I think, is like a good way to approach it.
Mm-hmm. When it does come to education, and if you're going into a club with staff that are male, staff that are female, that maybe haven't discussed this amongst the coaching team or the playing staff, whatever that may be, what's your first port of call in trying to break down them barriers to actually start discussing this?
Often I like to do education sessions that are mixed, so you want to have the athletes and the staff there. I think my supervisory team were all men. So from the word go, I had to talk about heavy menstrual bleeding as if it was the most normal thing in the world. And I think when I was 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, probably, I was so embarrassed about periods. And I think that's actually a big motivation of mine right now. But I think that actually, like, just being completely factual and scientific about it really, really helps. And I think breaking it down into phases like we do also means, so for example, at Chelsea, they just they don't say, oh, they're on their period. They say, oh, they're in phase 1. So even though I'm not like excusing the need to talk about it, but I do think that helps. The other thing is, like, we've now got a Fitter Coach platform, like a coach platform, which again enables coaches to have the discussion. It talks to our app so that you have the discussion, but you don't necessarily have to communicate on poolside or on the side of the football pitch where you might feel a little bit awkward. And that's not like taking away the need to have the discussion. I think just little things like that can help with the facilitation. Again, I do think having someone external coming in to talk about it probably helps, or someone like maybe I hate to say like a female doctor or a female practitioner initially raise it, and I hate that because I hate the gender stereotype-ness to it. Or actually some other clients have got like podcasts, so like this, and they've just said to their athletes, go in, have a listen. We've actually launched a podcast for like that being one of the primary reasons, just to say, go in, have a listen, educate yourself, and then we can talk about it. But at least they're not the one stuttering, stumbling over it, because maybe they haven't previously been educated, or they understandably just feel a little bit awkward about it.
Mm-hmm. So is that platform that you talk about linked to Orreco, or is that something separate?
It's linked to Orreco. So we have so as part of our female athlete program, we have an app that's called Fitter Woman, FITR WOMAN. And that is totally free to download. I can tell you the whole story about it if you want to hear it, but basically...
Absolutely, love it.
Okay, so you're going to regret asking this in 10 minutes when I finish telling you, but basically while I was doing my PhD, as I said, I got like really, really into this area, and I was just like, oh my gosh, like every day I'd read another paper and I'd just be like totally obsessed. One of my colleagues at Orreco, Gronya Knefri, is a product development manager. So effectively her aim and her role at Orreco was very much to see what the science team were doing and work out how she could make that suitable for our clients. And I just remember like 9 p.m. phone calls when I was driving back from the lab at St. Mary's, and I'd just be like waffling away to her about, and did you know this, and did you know that, and this person said this, and this athlete in the lab today, she was struggling like with her premenstrual symptoms, and I was reading about it, or whatever. And so then I literally have such vivid memories of driving out of Bushy Park past Hampton Court Palace, if you know the area, and she, having sent me a voice note that day saying, I've got something really exciting to talk to you about, she then called me and was like, Georgie, let's try and convince Brian, CEO of Orreco, Brian, to give us some money to build an app. And so then we went away, we wrote a pitch, true like Dragon's Den style, Shark Tank style. And yeah, he like heard us out. And then he said, right, you've got 6 months to build an app to get 10,000 downloads and basically to prove that this is worthwhile. And so that's what we did. And then we kind of have kept developing it from there, which has been really cool. But after I submitted my PhD, I had this really cool opportunity to go and speak at a conference in New Zealand. If anyone's ever like keen to see how like female programs are really well run, New Zealand are absolutely dominating. They've got like a Whisper program. Stacey Sims is part of it, Dr. Bruce Hamilton. It's amazing. And I was so lucky to go over and speak there at this like female health summit they had. And I also went to Australia, and then I came back via the States, which is where I actually had a really good chat with Dawn then, and I met with you swimming. It was such an unbelievable trip and amazing to like submit my PhD and just go. But the thing that just came hammering home every single conversation I had was coaches need this information too. It's all well and good athletes having it, but coaches need it too. So on the back of that, again, our amazing product team at Orreco went away and developed a coach platform. So that's called Fitter Coach. And the app, the Fit to Women app, can link up to the coach platform. So it's an educational resource. It's got loads of publications to read. Obviously, everything we do is fully scientifically backed. We've got like a very intricate scoring system to enable any like science to be included into our platforms. And it also lets a coach see on any one day where an athlete is in their menstrual cycle, if they've missed a period, if they've logged symptoms, and it explains more about hormonal contraception, menstrual dysfunctions, etc. So now that's actually used like globally, as is the app, which is pretty cool.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. So you mentioned the phases there, and at Chelsea, them saying, they're in phase 1 or phase 2. Can we dive a little bit deeper into that? I know I discussed that with Dawn, but I think it's great to go over it again and get your take on it and things. So different phases. Can you talk to us about potential symptoms and how you do actually put the phase into phases?
Yeah. So firstly, the phases are derived from hormonal profiles, so changes in hormones. And obviously, in an ideal world, you would measure and confirm these hematologically. So you'd take blood and work out exactly what the hormonal profile is in every single athlete. But that is unbelievably expensive, unbelievably challenging. And also, what does it mean? Because every athlete responds to hormones slightly differently. And every athlete or every woman has different numbers of receptors for different hormones. So basically, the concept and the way we work is very much to keep it as simple as we can based on the research that's out there. So we've broken the menstrual cycle down into 4 distinct phases. Phase 1 is when you're menstruating. So not you, but when one is menstruating. And that's where hormone levels are really low. So the 2 primary ovarian hormones, estrogen and progesterone, and what we focus on for the purposes of the app. And so hormone levels are very low for phase 1. And then when you stop menstruating, you go into phase 2, which is kind of the second half of the follicular phase. And that's like dominated by increases in estrogen to a point where ovulation occurs. And then that's where estrogen like drops down to facilitate ovulation. And then you jump into the second half of your menstrual cycle, which is called the luteal phase. And that starts with phase 3, and that's where levels of estrogen and progesterone increase. Progesterone has been low throughout the whole of phases 1 and 2, so the whole of the follicular phase. And then, say in phase 3, it's basically dominated by both estrogen and progesterone. People often call that the high hormone phase. And then the premenstrual window is what we call phase 4, and that's where hormone levels decline. So both estrogen and progesterone, levels of them, decrease right the way down to start phase 1 again. And that's like effectively the process that facilitates the release of the endometrial lining, which is the menstrual bleed. And loads of other like kind of hormonal and biochemical changes are going on throughout that process to kind of facilitate it. But essentially that's it in a nutshell. And then if you want me to like delve deeper into what that means from an athlete perspective. Okay, so obviously every athlete is different. And so for our Fitter Women app, any woman out there is designed for any woman, not just athletes, can create their profile, they can log symptoms, they can see where their next period is due to start, and they can learn more. So they can learn about their physiology based on what they're logging, and what that means from a nutritional perspective, etc. So that's our kind of general Fitter Women app. And then you have our elite kind of female athlete program. And that's where we work on an individual level with typically elite athletes to really understand their menstrual cycle and their symptoms. So we start off by looking at symptoms, and different people obviously experience different numbers of symptoms, different symptoms at different times. But primarily, in terms of phases, phase 1 would be often where people experience a relatively large number of symptoms. Some people, it may be more phase 4 specific, but during phase 1, we know that's where blood loss is occurring. That's where things like menstrual cramps might happen. People might feel bloated, have headaches, sleep is disturbed, etc. But in terms of what's going on and or how that affects what you should be doing as an athlete, or you should be doing with your athletes, so to bring about menstruation as hormones decline, there's this increase in release of these hormone-like substances called prostaglandins. Prostaglandins mediate an inflammatory response. So that is one of the reasons why people experience symptoms. And we know that there's a number of dietary elements that can help to firstly offset menstrual symptoms, and also can be used to manage that inflammation. So in phase 1, I always say, phase 4 and phase 1, to be honest, bring your A game to your diet. That's where you want to be super savvy. You want to make sure that alongside that, you're recovering well. So you're using all recovery strategies that you can after any sort of muscle damaging exercise. We also know that actually exercise is really good as a treatment for menstrual symptoms. Obviously, if you've got debilitating pain, then that's a different conversation. You should definitely see your medical doctor. But we know that exercise is a good kind of management strategy. So getting out and doing exercise is really important, particularly in the elite athlete space, where they need to be able to play and train at any time in the menstrual cycle. So yes, I would say that also you want to, bring your A game to nutrition. Obviously, we know that losing blood loses iron. There is a study that demonstrates a slight decrease in hepcidin, which is like a molecule that controls your ability to absorb iron towards the end of phase 1. So getting iron in specifically at that time is really important. In terms of I'm sure we'll come to this, in terms of injury risk, there is some data to suggest that in the first half of the menstrual cycle, risk of certain injury types might be increased. I feel like more research is definitely needed around this, but regardless, I would say just be proactive in terms of risk management strategies. I'm more than happy to talk to anyone more on a specific level about this, but I think research is constantly emerging around this, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how that goes.
Where we are now in terms of the research, is there any particular area that is more susceptible? Yeah,
so people say that, or some research points to anterior cruciate ligament ruptures being more likely in the first half of the menstrual cycle, with some showing an increase just prior to ovulation as estrogen levels peak. And that does make sense in a practical, or looking at it practically. We know that estrogen levels can increase laxity of ligaments. So there's estrogen receptors around the anterior cruciate ligament. So increased estrogen in the body can increase that laxity. We also know, so Dr. Ellen Casey over in New York has done some really cool research around looking at changes in neuromuscular firing patterns. And there is, again, some research to suggest that these might be altered a little bit around that time. But there's so many other things that need to be looked at, ankle injuries, muscle pulls. And I think, that's something I'm really, really keen to keep delving into. I've definitely seen some preliminary research coming out, and we do have some preliminary data ourselves looking at injury risk, but I think it's definitely one that I don't want to jump and make athletes scared, because that's the last thing you want to do. You just want to help them be proactive and be prepared. Anyway, I'm really conscious I was supposed to be going on my phase journey. Do you want me to?
Oh, no, it's all right. Just one more question on phase one.
Yeah, go for it.
I know there's probably there will be individual differences, but in terms of time frame, how long we're looking at in phase one?
So typically, so it's the number of bleed days. Typically, you would see anywhere from 3 to 7 days. Some people may have a very short bleed. That would be quite abnormal. And it would flag a potential kind of dysregulation to the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, which is the process by which menstruation occurs or the reproductive system occurs. Some people may have like 8 days, but any longer than that, again, I definitely want to get medical input there. The other thing just to say about phase one is like some people really notice mood disturbances there. Typically, it would be right at the beginning of phase one. Some people do feel that it's almost like a massive relief when they start menstruating. So it's very much like different people have different perceptions and different feelings, as we said. Some athletes can experience changes in coordination, feeling weaker, feeling their performance is affected. But again, like to this date, I haven't come across anyone who we haven't really managed to get a handle on that. So I feel like there are some simple kind of nutritional, lifestyle, recovery ways that those things can be handled. And actually, one point that I always need to emphasize is that unless there is an underlying menstrual dysfunction, I really don't believe that there's any reason why, I really believe that there's no reason why an athlete can't perform at their best at any time point in their menstrual cycle, as long as they are tracking their menstrual cycle, they're fully aware and proactive around their menstrual cycle.
So we're just going to take a very quick break in the chat with Georgie. Hope you're enjoying part one. So over in part two, we continue on this theme of discussing the menstrual cycle and how that affects elite female performers. So more on health screening, busting some myths and some common misunderstandings. Some really interesting chat around nutrition adjustments during different phases of the menstrual cycle. And we finish off with a little chat around oral contraception. So really interesting part two coming up with Georgie. This episode of the Pacey Performance Podcast is sponsored by AthleteMonitoring.com, the world's most comprehensive, versatile and cost-effective athlete health and performance management platform for elite sports. So AthleteMonitoring.com is trusted by top development programs, universities, professional teams, Olympic programs, national sports organizations and research institutes worldwide. It streamlines data collection, centralizes the management of wellness, training and performance, medical and testing, and administrative data. It also simplifies the interpretation with best practice analytics and evidence-based methods to optimize performance and reduce injury risk. So with all these features on a single platform, AthleteMonitoring.com seamlessly brings key stakeholders together to build healthier athletes, more efficient organizations, and long-lasting successes. To see what AthleteMonitoring.com can do for you, visit AthleteMonitoring.com and schedule a free demo, or follow them on Twitter at AthleteMonitor. This episode is also sponsored by Omega Wave, which is the only non-invasive at-rest technology on the market that analyses readiness to train via both brain and cardiac analysis. So using DC potential and HRV to understand your brain's energy level and autonomic nervous system balance allows you to use objective data on recovery and readiness that in turn helps you to truly individualize your training and thus optimize performance. Omega Wave also measures ECG from the V6 position, and this data can be used by the medical profession to check cardiac health on a frequent basis. The measurement only takes 4 minutes to perform and results are visualized in an intuitive way thanks to our windows of trainability concept. Omega Wave is used by hundreds of elite sport athletes, military and law enforcement agencies. They are also an official partner of the UFC Performance Institute, so to learn more about Omega Wave, visit their website omegawave.com or visit their social media channels.
Okay.
So it's chosen to get. I guess that's a big point. I mean, we spoke about this in the webinar, but I'm guessing that can often be lead to certain anxiety of when certain phase is going to fall, if it's going to fall on a match day, and then anxiety goes up, and obviously all the negatives that come with that in terms of performance, in terms of general mental health, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and the worst thing is just to like make the issue even worse, to exacerbate it. Like anxiety also can cause the cycle to be dysregulated, and it can cause more symptoms. So it's just like a self-perpetuating nightmare if you're not careful. Yeah. So a lot of, again, like managing that anxiety is so important. And often, around big competitions, that's where you see the increased levels of stress. So that's got a massive part to play. And I really believe as well, in terms of the education perspective, like that's a really important message to communicate to both athletes and support staff, to help them I guess like be proactive and work out ways to manage it in advance. And sometimes it literally is the discussion around it. Like once they've had the discussion, they know what to expect, they're prepared, they're tracking their cycle, they know when their period is likely to fall. Obviously when you taper, it can alter things, but you also would want it not to alter things, because you've got the kind of balance in energy availability all set.
I won't interrupt again.
No, that's okay. I'm just really mindful I'm going off on tangents.
No, it's great. It's great. Should we move on to phase 2 and symptoms and all that kind of stuff? Yeah. Okay,
so phase 2 is often where athletes either are just like, oh, I didn't notice anything, or they just feel really good. So this is where estrogen is more dominant, or estrogen is dominant. And estrogen is typically associated with increased releases of hormones like serotonin and dopamine, so like feel-good hormones. So often people say they've got more energy, they feel like they're able to recover better from training. So estrogen also has been shown to have increased oxidative capacity, so it helps to helps with muscle recovery effectively. So it is more of an anabolic hormone, and is just generally, I guess, associated with more positive outcomes. However, not everyone feels that. Some people, as I said, some people definitely do, some people don't. In terms of like other aspects, there is some research that suggests that it might be more important to like carbohydrate load before endurance events at this time. But other than that, like I would say the key thing for me in phase 2 is all about like if there is a slight increase in injury risk, and again that may well be like individual athlete specific, just ensuring that you're doing all you can to warm up, warm down, getting soft tissue treatment, but also not being over manipulated. So my physio, Mark Buckingham, is like so on it with the menstrual cycle, and I just love to see the fact that he's male, he's got so much experience, and he can see it. And he always says, I would never manipulate a sacroiliac joint in the middle of the menstrual cycle, because that is where ligament laxity, he's seen it, is increased. And so then that will cause an athlete to over-rotate, destabilize their back, and then that increases risk of certain injuries. So my body is like totally like that as well. So that's something which is totally relevant to me too. So that's phase 2. And then when estrogen levels peak and just as ovulation occurs, some people experience some ovulation pain. I've seen a fair few people with flare-ups of previous injuries, particularly those driven by inflammation. Again, as hormones decline, there can be this associated inflammatory response, and this short-term like pain, typically around the ovary, in the ovarian area, which shouldn't last too long, but some people are much more sensitive to that than others. I've literally got one athlete who gets a flare-up of an ankle injury every single time mid-cycle. It's very interesting. And then we move into phase 3. I love phase 3. It's so interesting, and I think data is like really emerging about phase 3. So phase 3 is the high hormone phase. So progesterone kind of enters the mix. Now, there's some really interesting research about progesterone, and like a lot of people are, I feel, have an increased sensitivity to progesterone, so their mood can be affected. They can feel more anxious in the second half of the menstrual cycle. They can feel a little bit more tired. If you think about it, progesterone is very much a hormone that's involved in the like pregnancy process. So your body effectively is like slightly protecting. So if you do have like a developing embryo, then you might not have quite as much energy like outwardly because your body is like slightly being more protective. This isn't the case for everyone. Some people like don't notice that much of a difference. Some people might feel like even better in the second half of the menstrual cycle, but often people do feel that their mood is slightly affected. They might feel a bit more irritable. Another thing that often I'm increasingly seeing is a delayed or like a delayed recovery or increased muscle soreness. And there's some research showing that progesterone has some catabolic properties, so it breaks down amino acids. So that can effectively result in increased like muscle breakdown this time in the menstrual cycle. So I think in terms of protein intake, particularly before training, we know that women often aren't as good at eating protein than men might be. Like ensuring that you're getting enough in at that time is very important. Also, sleep can be disrupted because body temperature is a little bit increased, heart rate can be increased a little bit, breathing rate can be increased a little bit, and particularly if you're asthmatic or you're at altitude, you might notice that more. Again, different people have different hormonal sensitivities, and I think once you start working with an athlete, you can really start to see patterns in the data that they're logging, which it's just so interesting. I love it. It's like a puzzle that you're unearthing. Anyway, so I think in phase 3 specifically, it's very much about looking at fueling strategies to manage symptoms. So looking at if you are experiencing delayed recovery, then how can you like get on top of that? But also if you're, are you doing everything you can in terms of recovery strategies too alongside that? Also people often start to experience cravings in phase 3. I was working with an athlete last year and I remember sitting down with her and she said to me, oh, my menstrual cycle, I get such bad pain. And I was like, oh, okay, well, what other symptoms do you get? And she was like, I just get so annoyed. I just get really frustrated at certain times of her menstrual cycle. But she'd never tracked or looked at her cycle before. And she just knew that there were times where she was just like irrationally angry. Anyway, I was like, well, talk me through your diet. And she was just talking me through her diet. And I was like, that doesn't sound too bad, to be honest. And then I was like, is it like that the whole time? She's like, oh, no, when my period's just about to start, I do like some chocolate. And I was like, when you say chocolate, what do you mean? And she was like, oh, I eat one of those chocolate bars. And I was like, chocolate bars? And she was like, oh, those giant bars, and 2 packs of biscuits. And I was like, oh my gosh. But actually, like, cravings are real, and you can, like, your body, so your insulin resistance also changes in phase 3, so research has shown. And so that means that your like ability to control your blood sugar is slightly altered. So you're typically you start craving things that are often sweeter things or carbohydrate dense things. So again, loads of management around that can be put in place and can be used really effectively. The other thing is like really working on sleep disruptions. So we've got a number of like sleep strategies that help in phase 3 as well. So there's loads of like hands-on ways. I'm sure I've missed other things to be aware of in phase 3, but there's loads of hands-on things you can do to help I guess like dominate phase 3, as I like to put it. I always like to be positive. It's not about like surviving any time in the menstrual cycle. It's about like using it, being proactive. And then phase 4, which is the premenstrual phase where hormones decline, you have this increase in prostaglandins. Also, people experience changes to their neurobiology. So there's hormone receptors in the brain. And as hormone levels change, then that obviously affects like stimulation to the brain. And for some people, that can result in real changes to mood again. Like in the phase before when hormone levels increase, like some people who are sensitive to those changes can experience mood changes as well. But the hormonal changes can also affect like the renin and angiotensin system. So like our ability to control like blood pressure and like water retention and things like that. So that can affect bloating, also cause headaches. Also, this increase in inflammation can all result in those can cause symptoms like that in phase 4. And I guess practically speaking, again, like trying to exercise is really important. And again, with this premise that as long as you're managing these, I really don't feel this should hold you back. But it is important just to think from a recovery standpoint, if there is an increase in inflammation, which again might tip over into phase one, just be super mindful of that, particularly as a coach. Like if you do have athletes who do have extreme symptoms, then that could be aligned to inflammation. So it might take them that much longer to recover. So how can you be proactive to manage that? And doing like, I don't know, if you were a track athlete and your coach was trying to re-simulate a like heats, rounds, final scenario, obviously you don't want to avoid mimicking that in the premenstrual window because you could be racing whenever. But if you were doing that on a regular basis in that phase 4 window, I'd just be mindful that the athlete might be tired for a few days after, just because it's like adding inflammation to the already known levels of inflammation that exist at that time. So yeah, bringing your A game to nutrition, recovery, etc. is super important. One thing I'm very mindful I haven't really discussed at all is training in the menstrual cycle, exercise training.
That was the next one, yeah.
So there is some research out there looking at different training modalities and how the human body, based on hormonal profile, might be able to adapt to them at different times in the menstrual cycle. So, for example, it's better to focus on strength training in the first half of the menstrual cycle. There is some research actually suggesting that. Ross Julian at Münster University actually did a study looking at repeated yo-yo sprints and adaptation based on menstrual cycle phase, and actually found that there was like increased adaptation in the follicular phase in the first half of the menstrual cycle. And I would align that to estrogen and the like kind of recovery capacity potentially of estrogen. However, and he would openly say this, I feel like more research is needed before we as practitioners would ever start changing training. And I think that also kind of contradicts with the messaging that I always want to be very firm in, that actually at the end of the day, the first thing you want to do is manage symptoms. Like unless you've managed symptoms, there's no point even progressing. But also like an athlete can train and perform at any time in their menstrual cycle, providing they don't have an underlying dysfunction. So I think, yes, okay, on an individual athlete basis, every athlete is an individual, and really, you know, understanding your athletes, if you're a coach out there, like that is really important. But I think it might be on an individual basis, you can see that someone is like got more energy or typically does recover faster in the first half of the menstrual cycle, then happy days, like do that. Just ensure that they are still recovering, they're not putting their body under undue risk. But I just don't think we're at a point of just being totally blanket, everyone should do this, everyone should do that, particularly because we're not measuring hormones on a regular basis and sensitivity to them and numbers of receptors. So yeah.
I know you've mentioned it quite a few times along going through the phases about nutrition, and I know you've given some recommendations, but as a kind of a summary in terms of nutrition, is there anything you can sum up from what you've mentioned around the phases? Okay, phase 1, maybe a bit more of this, a bit less of this, but you know, I know that's quite blanket and quite general, but I think
I mean, the first thing, like all of this information is in the app, but I'd say, so phase 1 is like a gain to nutrition, factoring in the fact that you're losing blood. So you definitely want to look at increasing iron intake, particularly towards the end of that phase where there is this slight like hepcidin decrease. I think like a healthy balanced diet, but totally adding in your antioxidants and anti-inflammatory foods. I think often, so jumping into phase 2 again is often where athletes are like, woohoo, I'm grand, I'm fine. Some people say that their appetite decreases a little bit at this time. And I think it's really important to think that, so if the menstrual cycle elongates, so ideally for me, I want every athlete to be menstruating on a regular basis with little variation between cycle length from cycle to cycle. If they are, then that tells us that the body is in an adaptive state. So the body is able to adapt and respond as well as possible to training. We know that if cycles elongate, risk of illness and injury is increased. And it just shows that the body isn't happy. And if the cycle does elongate, typically that happens with a delay to ovulation. So just ensuring that an athlete is eating enough in phase 2, even if they don't feel quite as hungry, is really important. So particularly carbohydrate wise, obviously women can be a bit carbohydrate phobiaed. Hopefully we're moving away from that now, but I think that is really, really important. Then moving on into phase 3. So phase 3 is like, okay, this is where you need to be thinking about protein as well. Obviously you do anyway, but even more so, and ensuring that you're having serves of protein at every single meal, I would say, and like decent serves, say like 20 to 25 grams, and potentially like spread throughout the day alongside it. So maybe like 5 hits, alongside some complex carbohydrates that will help manage recovery, it will help manage cravings, and keep blood sugar levels a bit more stable. I'd also say that, carbohydrate is still very much important. We know that any exercise over 70% of like total max intensity needs carbohydrate to fuel it regardless. But I'd say that there should also be like you're ensuring that you're having an emphasis on fat intake too, because fat helps with the production and making of hormones. So estrogen and progesterone need fat to be made, and again you need healthy fats throughout the menstrual cycle, but again that is just important to think about that in phase 3. So in phase 4 it's really important that again you bring your A game to your nutrition. So again, as hormones decline, there's this inflammatory response. So really having like an anti-inflammatory focus is important. Alongside that, there is some evidence to suggest like a diet slightly higher in fiber might be good at this time. But again, like I would say that's symptom-led. And there's also another study which actually is relatively recent, looking at how the sensitivity of the gut changes at different times in the menstrual cycle, and actually premenstrually in phase 4 gut sensitivity can be a little bit increased. The other bit of like I guess research that actually really is quite relevant is like omega status and intake of fish and oily fish specifically around the menstrual cycle, and having a good like omega profile means that you can tolerate inflammation better. Obviously the menstrual cycle is an inflammatory process, so actually ensuring that if you like fish, then like that would be particularly premenstrually it'd be a good time to have that. But also if you don't, then ideally you'd go and measure your omega profile, but if not, it would be worthwhile thinking about that. There's also like a whole range of other bits of research really breaking down vitamins and minerals in the menstrual cycle, and I could go into that in much more detail, but I'd probably bore you significantly. But again, I think phase 4 is like try and reduce intake of like processed and refined foods at a high level, and just like be super savvy with ensuring you're fueling regularly enough, with the right things, anti-inflammatory focus, fiber focus in some circumstances, monitoring hydration, looking at sleep, like everything.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm conscious of your time and not wanting to take up too much of it. I know we're coming to an hour, which I promised I'd keep you for this evening. But contraception, briefly.
Yes.
What should we know about contraception?
Yeah. Okay, good question. So there are a whole range of different types of hormonal contraception. In athletes, certain athletes might be more likely to use certain types. Certain countries might be more likely to promote certain types or advocate certain types. And certain practitioners even often have their own kind of feelings about it, and about which would be the best type of option. I think stepping back, the two things you need to think about is that there are 2 categories of hormonal contraception. There is combined types, which contain synthetic, which is what we would call exogenous estradiol, and a progestin. Typically, the estradiol would be called ethinyl estradiol. There's only a few types of combined hormonal contraception that don't use that. And then there's a whole range of different types of progestin. And within combined types of hormonal contraception, there's the pill, there is the vaginal ring, and there's also an estrogen patch with a progestogen pill. So that's the combined type. It works by suppressing ovulation, suppressing natural endogenous hormones, putting artificial hormones in the body. Then there's progesterone only options. So there's the mini pill, progesterone only pill. Then there's the intrauterine device, the hormonal intrauterine device. There's the implant, and there is also the injection. Now, all of these have like variants of the same type of mechanism. Some have more progesterone in them than others, but they effectively create a environment in a woman that means that sperm implantation is unfavorable. Some of them also suppress ovulation. It depends on the different type. We've actually gone into more information about this in our podcast in loads and loads of detail, because I think the most important thing is that athletes or women out there understand what they're putting into their body. So if they're putting in a pill, or if they're having an injection or using an implant, they understand what that means, what it is, what it does, and what it means. And within each type of hormonal contraception, so for example, the combined pill, there's like so many different types of combined pill with different doses of estrogen in them, or there's the monophasic, biphasic, triphasic. There's so many different options out there. So being informed, I think, is super, super important. And some people go on the pill, well, for reasons that are primarily contraception based. Some people go on the pill or on forms of hormonal contraception to manage symptoms. Everyone's got like a different journey to why they want to use it, or use hormonal contraception generally. But again, I think it's always important to, in my eyes, unless there's a real need to intervene, as little as possible, but also to, if you are, understand what that means, how that might affect you, but also if you're using the pill to control symptoms, well, are your symptoms actually better on the pill? Have you looked at other means to control symptoms first? If you're using it for hormonal contraception, the last thing you want is to get pregnant at the peak of your athletic career, then that's a different discussion. So yeah, there's lots of things that need to be considered when thinking about that.
For more info, you mentioned the podcast.
Yes.
That brings me on to a little conclusion for this podcast for your time. But where can people find it?
Yeah, so basically two of me and a couple of friends, like kind of, I don't know, over the last few years, we've always wanted to help educate people and talk about these areas more. And we just kind of got together and decided to come up with a podcast. So it's called the Female Athlete Podcast, available on all podcast providers. And yeah, it's very much about educating people, speaking with athletes about their experiences, but also even right now looking at COVID and the impacts of COVID and what that means for a woman, what that means generally for an athlete. And we see athletes as anyone who exercises. So it's very much available for everyone. And we're hoping to have a couple of coach editions where we talk to coaches about, particularly male coaches actually, about their understanding and experiences, and work out how we can help people moving forwards.
Awesome. And if anyone's got any more questions based on what we've discussed or anything else, what's the best place for people to get in touch with you?
So we've got like a general fitterwomen@orreco.com email address. I've got like Twitter handles, Instagram, whatever, if people want to send me a message via either of them. Any means, feel free to reach out, anyone.
Great, no, it's fine. I'll obviously include you in all the posts that go out so people can easily click on your profile and reach out and ask any questions and a bit of discussion and all that kind of good stuff.
Bro, thank you.
Does that sound all right? Well, thank you very much for your time, George. I really do appreciate it. It's great to chat to you again.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure.
And it's great to see that you're so interested in this area as well.
It's absolutely fascinating. And I'll be making people squirm at Christmas parties in the future, no doubt, talking about it.
I really do feel that the more we can unlock this side of female physiology, the more we're going to progress female performance. So exciting times ahead.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. Pleasure to talk to you again.
Thank you.
Cheers, Georgie.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to episode 294 of the Pacey Performance Podcast. I hope you enjoyed the chat with Georgie. Firstly, massive thanks to Georgie for giving up her time to speak to me on the podcast. I think she was dying. I know she was dying to get out for a run on the evening that we did it. So really appreciate her fitting me into her tight schedule. So also big thanks to Hawking Dynamics, iMeasureU, Athlete Monitoring, and Omega Wave for sponsoring this episode today. As I say every week, the podcast could not happen in its current form without the support of these guys, so really appreciate their ongoing support. So got some really cool guests coming up over the next couple of weeks, both on audio, on iTunes, Spotify, etc, but also on video. But sadly, this was not on video for a technical hitch on my end, so I'm looking to rectify that. So thank you for tuning in, thank you for your support.